Thanks for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here and to be speaking to such a distinguished audience. All right, so I'm going to share my screen with you and go through the presentation now. Okay, hopefully you can all see this. So that's the title, Extremism, a Philosophical Analysis. Now, I want to start off by reminding you of something that happened last year in the UK. So in the UK, there is an organization called Extinction Rebellion, which is basically a kind of response to the climate emergency. Extinction Rebellion is a non-violent organization that campaigns for governments to respond adequately to climate change. Now, last year, the Guardian newspaper reported as follows: counter-terrorism police placed Extinction Rebellion on a list of extremist ideologies that should be reported to the authorities running the PREVENT program. That's the counter-terrorism program in the UK. Extinction Rebellion featured alongside threats to national security, such as neo-Nazi terrorism and a pro-terrorist Islamist group. So later that day, Extinction Rebellion released a press release in response to this report, basically saying that it was an outrage that they had been classified as an extremist group, and they asked whether this was in fact a deliberate attempt to silence a legitimate cause. Now, this is a very familiar pattern of debate, will be familiar to all of you, where essentially the label extremist is used as a term of abuse. And when you look at this, exchange between Extinction Rebellion and its critics, I mean, you might think, well, doesn't this really show that the label extremist just isn't a useful label? I mean, it's just used to criticize one's political opponents, and it really has no real meaning. Now, I want to resist that. I mean, it seems to me that although the label is misused in all sorts of ways in political debate, it is nevertheless a label that picks out a genuine phenomenon, the phenomenon of extremism, and they classify organizations or individuals as extremists. Of course, the label is misused, but lots of labels are misused. But I think about the label democracy. I mean, as far as I know, the North Koreans regard themselves as a democracy. So that's a misuse of the label democracy. But I don't think we would want to conclude from that that the label democracy serves no useful purpose, or that there's no such thing as democracy. So my mission in this talk is really to kind of extract some sense from all this talk of extremism and try and make something of this phenomenon, while acknowledging that the label is used in this this way that's illustrated by the first slide. So here are the three questions then that I would like to address. Now, of course, I'm not going to be able to address these questions in any detail in 20 minutes, but these, I think, are the fundamental questions. So the first question, of course, is what is extremism? What are we talking about when we talk about extremism or describe certain individuals or groups or extremists? So that's the first question. The second question is about the usefulness of the concept of extremism. Is it a useful concept? Does it actually help us to analyze or understand a real phenomenon? Or is it just a term of abuse? Well, I've already told you my answer to that question, that it does help us to understand and analyze a real phenomenon. The last question, I think in some ways is perhaps in practical terms the most important question, which is extremism necessarily a bad thing? I mean, clearly Extinction Rebellion thought that it was an insult to be classified as extremists, but should they have thought of things in that way? Aren't there, in fact, circumstances in which extremism is perfectly justified? So some of you may be familiar with the great Philip Roth novel, American Pastoral, in which he has a character called Mary, who is talking to her father. Her father's baffled by her political extremism. And Mary says at one point, sometimes you have to fucking go to the extreme. Isn't that just true? And certainly if you think of the climate emergency, you might think, well, look, isn't that a case where extreme measures are perfectly justified? And of course, this idea of extremism as in some circumstances a good thing is one that's been defended by many people. Martin Luther King Jr. is someone who endorses a version of that view. And on the slide, you see a famous quotation from the right-wing American politician Barry Goldwater, who contested the 1964 presidential election. And Goldwater famously said, "Extremism in defense of liberty is no vice, and moderation in pursuit of justice is no virtue." So I need to say something about that issue. Okay, so let's get going with the first question. What is extremism? I want to distinguish between three forms of extremism, or if you prefer, three types of extremist. So first of all, there's what I call methods extremism. So methods extremists are individuals or organizations or even states that use or endorse the use of extreme methods in pursuit of their political objectives. Right, so this is all about the methods that are used in pursuit of one's political objectives. Now, of course, the big question here is going to be, what is an extreme method? How do you understand an extreme method? Now, on that issue, of course, a common view is that extreme methods are simply violent methods. Hence the idea that extremism is violent extremism. Now, that seems to me to be a mistake, or at least a gross oversimplification. And on the one hand, I want to argue that there are extreme methods that are non-violent. For example, hunger strikes have been used by political prisoners in Northern Ireland in pursuit of political status. And some of in the 1980s, several IRA prisoners died as a result of hunger strikes. And it's not obvious that the method that they were using to make a political point was violent, but it certainly was an extreme method. So that's one possibility, extreme methods without violence. It's also, I think, debatable whether the use of violence necessarily makes one a methods extremist. So if you think about the ANC's campaign against apartheid in South Africa, Mandela defended the ANC's use of violence on the grounds that there was no alternative. If he was right about that, if violence was the only way of overthrowing apartheid, and apartheid was an unjust and cruel system of government, which it was, in that case, I think it's not obvious that we want to say that the ANC were methods extremists. So that's one cluster of issues that of course would need to be discussed at much greater length in a fuller presentation. I mean, of course, another issue here that we would need to get into is, how do you define violence? Right? I mean, a very big and complicated question, which I'm not able to go into today. All right, so that's methods extremism. The second type of extremism that I want to distinguish is what I call ideological extremism. So ideological extremists are individuals or organizations or states that subscribe to an extremist ideology. So I think of ideologies as occupying positions, locations in ideological space. Now, ideological space, as I conceive of it, is multi-dimensional. So one dimension of ideological space is the left to right dimension. There are other dimensions. There's ideological space can be divided according to one's view of authoritarianism. So there are more or less authoritarian ideologies. On this view, an extremist ideology is one that stands at one end, at the far end of ideological space. Now, because ideological space is multi-dimensional, it follows that an ideology that is in the middle of one dimension might be at the extreme end of another dimension. And so if you think about ultra-communism and fascism, you might think that they are at one end of the left they're at opposite ends of the left to right spectrum, one on the extreme left and the other on the extreme right. But if you look at the authoritarianism spectrum, it seems as if they're in the same place on the authoritarianism spectrum. They're at the pro-authoritarian end of that spectrum. So that's ideological extremism. So if you want to develop this idea of extremism, of course, you need to say what you mean by an ideology, and you need to explain exactly what is meant by ideological space, how you determine the dimensions of ideological space, and how do you determine an ideology's location along a given dimension. I have a lot to say about this, but not today. Now, the last kind of extremism that I distinguish is what I call psychological extremism. So psychological extremists are basically individuals or groups that have what I call an extremist mindset. Okay, so now we're not talking about ideology, we're talking about mindset. Now, when I talk about a mindset as I see it is constituted by, among other things, a set of preoccupations, certain characteristic attitudes, certain characteristic emotions, and certain characteristic ways of thinking. And so extremists on this view are people who have certain characteristic preoccupations. And I'll give you some examples of what I take to be extremist preoccupations in a minute. Extremists have certain characteristic attitudes, and I'll tell you what they are in a little while. Okay, now if you accept this tripartite distinction between methods extremism, ideological extremism, and psychological extremism, then of course there are going to be all sorts of complex relationships between them. So, for example, maybe it's true that ideological extremists are more likely to be methods extremists. Maybe it's true that psychological extremists are more likely to be ideological extremists. So these are all matters for further investigation. There are all sorts of complicated relationships here between these three types of extremism. But nevertheless, I want to say that they are conceptually distinct, and the challenge is to do justice to each of these three varieties. Now, I've said a little bit about methods and ideological extremism. I want to say a bit more about psychological extremism. So I talk about extremist preoccupation. So what do I mean by that? So here are what I regard as at least two rather typical extremist preoccupations. So one extremist preoccupation is what I call the purity preoccupation. So extremists are typically preoccupied with their religious, ethnic, or ideological purity, and they're preoccupied by the actual or threatened dilution of their religious, ethnic, or ideological purity by powerful external forces. So let's take the case of racial purity. Of course, the Nazis were obsessed by racial purity, and today you have white supremacists who are preoccupied with racial purity. So white supremacist organizations in the US, for example, want to set up an independent republic whose constitution would basically say that you can only be a citizen of this republic if you are of unmixed white European heritage. Okay, so that's one kind of purity. There's also ideological purity. A good example of that historically was the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia in the 1970s. The Khmer Rouge basically wanted to practice the purest, most unadulterated form of Marxism-Leninism, completely undiluted, no private property whatever, and essentially no individual rights of any sort. And this is all in pursuit of a kind of ideological purity. Let me just give you a nice example of this purity preoccupation from today. And this is an organization in India called the RSS, which is a Hindu extremist organization in India. And when you join the RSS, this is the oath that you need to take. And so the oath is, I take the oath that I will always protect the purity of the Hindu religion and the purity of Hindu culture for the supreme progress of the Hindu nation. So there you have a kind of absolutely crystal clear expression of this purity preoccupation. Another extremist preoccupation is the victimhood preoccupation. Extremists are preoccupied with their supposed victimization and humiliation by the other. If you think about incels today, these are involuntarily celibate men who have this preoccupation with the supposed persecution of men by women, where what they mean by persecution is women won't sleep with us. Now, of course, in that context, there is a preoccupation with what you might call humiliated masculinity. There is a preoccupation with persecution, but of course, it's important that the persecution is non-actual. Right? These are fantasies of persecution. So these are two examples of extremist preoccupations. When I talk about extremist attitudes, here are some characteristic extremist attitudes: hostility to compromise, intolerance of the other, and anti-pluralism. Now, this is a kind of complicated area, I think, because if you look at the issue of compromise in particular, you might want to say, well, look, surely just being a person of principle means that you will be unwilling to compromise. Okay, so isn't it going to be a mistake to say that hostility to compromise is a characteristic feature of the extremist mindset? Now, to deal with that concern, I would need to say more about the notion of compromise, and someone whose work I think is very helpful in this context is Avishai Margalit, who has an absolutely brilliant book on compromise and rotten compromise, in which he argues, and I'm summarizing, that compromise is a good thing, but what he calls rotten compromises are a bad thing. Right? So a rotten compromise is a compromise to maintain an unjust or cruel or inhuman regime. Right? So it was when the ANC rejected compromises with apartheid, that was fine. That didn't make them extremists, because the compromises they were rejecting were rotten compromises. Extremists, on the other hand, tend to regard all compromise as rotten compromise, and that is very much part and parcel of the extremist mindset. The anti-pluralist condition, I think, is also important. Extremists reject the idea that there is no uniquely right way of living. They think there is a uniquely right way of living, and what's more, that they are entitled to impose their vision of the good life on everybody else. So you see that with ISIS in the territory that it controls, where essentially everybody has to toe the line. So there are some extremist attitudes. Okay, now, let me now go back to my original questions. So in the light of what I was saying at the outset, the question was, are we talking about something real when we talk about extremism? It's actually true that ideologies occupy different positions in ideological space. I think that's true. Now, of course, the notion of ideological space is just an analytical tool, but it's a useful analytical tool for classifying different ideologies. And relative to this notion of ideological space, it seems to me that some ideologies, like Nazism, really are extremist. I think it's also true that the use of extreme methods by ideologically opposed actors is a real phenomenon. That's something real. It's not just a figment of our imagination that extremists employ extreme methods in pursuit of their ideological objectives. Think about Anders Breivik in Norway. Think about KSM, the 9/11 mastermind. These are all examples of people who used extreme methods in pursuit of their ideological objectives. And lastly, it seems to me that psychological extremism is something real insofar as there is such a thing as an extremist mindset. There are characteristic preoccupations, attitudes, ways of thinking, and emotions. These can be identified through the study of extremist organizations and groups, and also by conceptual analysis. So it doesn't seem to me to be correct in the end to say that there is no such thing as extremism. Of course, it doesn't follow from the fact that extremism is a real phenomenon, that the concept of extremism is a useful concept. It doesn't quite follow, right? So you might think, well, maybe there is such a thing as extremism, but it's not helpful to go around classifying people as extremists or as not extremists. again, that's something I'd want to resist. The concept, I want to say, is a useful concept in the sense that it helps us to explain and analyze certain forms of political thinking and behavior. If the concept didn't exist, we would have to invent it. Without this concept, it's going to be very difficult to capture what different extremists have in common, ideologically, psychologically, and methodologically. Okay, I now want to move on to my last question, which is, well, what extremism? What's wrong with extremism? Now, there are people who argue, I think in a way quite plausibly, that extremism has played a positive role in human history. So here's a quotation. As is widely acknowledged, we owe our political liberties today to some extremists of the past, and too much conformity is a danger to our intellectual life and social progress. And when people want to defend this view, an example that they very often point to is the American abolitionists, the people who campaigned against slavery. These people, in fact, regarded themselves as, if not extremists, then certainly as fanatics. And relative to American political culture at that time, you might want to say these people really were extremists. They were ideological extremists, and their extremism was a good thing. It was extremism in defense of justice and emancipation. I think there are some issues with this use of the label extremism. So here are some reasons why I think we shouldn't call these people extremists. I mean, number one, they didn't use extreme methods. The abolitionists, on the whole, didn't use extreme methods. Their campaign was, for the most part, a political campaign against slavery, and violence, although figured in a few examples, was certainly not the main method that they used. I think the abolitionists also lacked many of the characteristic preoccupations of extremism. They weren't interested in purity. They were against compromise with slaveholders, but the compromises they were opposed to were rotten compromises. So it's not that they had a problem with compromise in the political domain in general, but they certainly had a problem with rotten compromises. So what should we say then about the abolitionists, and what should we say in general about the idea that extremism is a good thing? So I want to suggest a distinction between extremism and radicalism. And I want to suggest that the supposed virtues of extremism are the actual virtues of something different from extremism, namely radicalism. I think that the people who want to kind of defend extremism in some circumstances, they are onto something. But what they're onto is the value of radicalism. And we shouldn't confuse that with the value of extremism. So here are some features of radicalism. Okay, number one, radicalism is opposed to gradualism. So classically, the abolitionists, a big debate between the radical and moderate abolitionists was over the issue of whether they were to campaign for the immediate emancipation of the slaves in America. And of course, the radical abolitionists were anti-gradualists. They demanded the immediate and unconditional emancipation of the slaves. Radicalism is opposed to rotten compromises, certainly. So if you're a radical, you're not going to compromise with slaveholders, you're not going to compromise with apartheid, and you're not going to compromise with regimes of cruelty and injustice. Radicalism endorses the pursuit of extra-institutional means in pursuit of its objectives. Right? So extra-institutional is the key, and extra-institutional does not mean violence. So that's another key feature of radicalism. So you can have sit-ins, you can have demonstrations, you can have many forms of protest that do not involve the use of violence. That is not to say that radicalism is opposed to violence per se. However, violence is not the default method of the radical. The radical only endorses violence in limited circumstances. And lastly, radicalism challenges mainstream thinking and questions assumptions that are usually unquestioned. Now, if you look at this list, you'll see that some of these features are that, of course, radicals have in common with extremists. So there is a certain degree of overlap, but on the other hand, there are also important differences between radicalism and extremism, in the sense there are lots of things that extremists are concerned with. There are lots of things that extremists endorse that radicals do not and should not endorse. Okay, so here's the kind of my parting shot today. History does indeed teach that radicalism has been the key to human progress and human freedom. Of course, that's true. Think about the radical Enlightenment. Think about the radical abolitionist movement. Think about the ANC in South Africa campaigning against apartheid. The radicalism in all of these cases has been the key to human progress and human freedom. And of course, I mean, going back to the example I started out with of Extinction Rebellion, what they might have said, instead of accusing their accusers of being extremists, what they might have said is that they're radicals but not extremists. Too much conformity is indeed a danger to our intellectual life and to social progress, but so is extremism, certainly if you understand extremism as I've understood it. A preoccupation with purity is not a route to social progress, quite the contrary. Right? A willingness to see, a disposition to see all compromises as rotten is not a pathway to social progress, certainly not. And when I talked about extremist thinking patterns, well, extremists often preoccupied with the apocalypse. They engage in conspiracy thinking. They engage in utopian thinking. These are characteristic extremist ways of thinking. Are they the key to human progress? Certainly not. Certainly not. Now, of course, conservative critics of radicalism like to confuse it with extremism. Conservative critics of radicalism like to call radicals extremists. And the one thing that radicals should not do is to go along with that. They shouldn't go along with that by saying, well, all right, well, we are extremists, but extremists is a good thing. They shouldn't do that. They should insist on a clear distinction, not only between the different varieties of extremism, but between extremism and radicalism. And they should concentrate on developing a non-extremist but radical response to cruelty, inhumanity, and injustice. So why not extremism? Well, the answer is that if you understand extremism as I understand it, extremism is not going to give you any of the good things that we should be after in the political realm. But there is something with which extremism is all too easily confused that I think is absolutely fine, and which I'm all in favor of, which is radicalism. Okay, well, thanks for listening. That's it. I'm done.
Thank you very much, Professor Cassam, for your very nice and very good presentation. I would like to ask any of the panelists whether they have any questions, comments. I haven't seen any. Let me check. Yeah, Vittorio, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was extremely useful and clear. I'm just wondering, in terms of the tripartite distinction, does one have to tick all three boxes to be an extremist? I mean, could I be an extremist in method, but not because I have views about purity preoccupations? So how does that?
Yeah. So I think you can be a methods extremist without having these preoccupations. I mean, let me give you an example, right? So if you think about the American neocons in the run-up to the 2003 Iraq War, they were methods extremists, right? I mean, that is to say, they endorsed the use of violence in pursuit of a political objective, namely regime change in Iraq, right? And not only did they endorse the use of violence, they endorsed the use of violence in circumstances in which there was an alternative to violence, right? So they couldn't really use the Mandela defense, which is there's no alternative to violence. There was an alternative, economic sanctions, for example. So that was an example of methods extremism. Now, were the neocons extremists in the other senses? Well, they might have been, or they might not have been. I mean, it's not really clear where on the ideological spectrum you put them. I mean, certainly on the right, but you know, are they fascists? I mean, who knows? Did they have a preoccupation with purity, with conspiracies? Arguably not. So I think that there is, in that sense, a separation between the different varieties of extremism, which is not to say, however, that being an extremist in one sense might not be a risk factor, as it were, for being an extremist in one of the other senses, right? So if you're a ideological extremist of the extreme right, a fascist or a neo-fascist, of course you're going to be pro-violence as well, right? Because fascist ideology is, in some senses, it's a cult of violence, and so there are causal connections between conceptually distinct forms of extremism.